Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, kind of depending on where you're at. Today we're going to be talking about how to convince your management team, your manager, your PI, leadership, that your lab needs a LIMS. I'm Hannah Brackey. I'm the director of product here at LabKey. I also have about 10 years of wet lab experience across different labs. Some of those labs we were using LIMS, some of them we weren't, and so I have varied past on whether or not I was successful in convincing my manager we need a LIMS. So hopefully I get to impart some of my learnings from those experiences to you guys today. Just some quick logistics. We are recording this, and so you'll get the recording after the meeting. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat when I'm presenting, and we'll try and get to them kind of towards the end. So in the meantime, let's kind of dive in here on really sort of level setting on what a LIMS is, right? And if you're here, you likely know that LIMS is a laboratory information management system. I found kind of two definitions online that I thought were useful in talking about. Wikipedia talks about a LIMS as a software that helps your lab. And that's kind of it. And I appreciate that definition because I do think that in many cases, LIMS do really help your lab perform operations. But I think there's a slightly more narrow definition that ChatGPT actually got a bit more correct, in my opinion, where a LIMS is really the solution that's designed to manage and streamline the operations in a laboratory. And I think specifically when we're talking about those operations, we're often talking about a handful of different things that can be valid within sort of that laboratory space. One of those things is sample and inventory management. So of course, knowing what you have in your freezers and your fridges, on your benches, as well as where those things are, maybe where they came from, going a step further, having additional metadata, especially if you're storing samples or inventory for a long time, it's really important to have those records of what you have, as well as sort of what has happened to those samples in the past to ensure good data integrity and reliability of experimentation later on. There's also sort of a test result or assay data management component to a lot of LIMS that really help labs operationalize their experimentation. So often you will want to be able to centralize all of your experiment or test result files or those final results within a single place. In many labs, you've got 15 different Excels open and you're copying and pasting to get that data sort of centralized. And so to operationalize that, to make that a little bit more streamlined, LIMS often helps with that centralization and aggregation of data. Also, it can help in some ways understand what does need to be tested. So if you're in a lab with very standardized operations, LIMS will often help collate some of that data for you to understand, what the next experiment should be, which can really streamline. Again, you're not sort of sifting through paper logs or other types of records, figuring out what still needs to be done. A big piece of LIMS, in my opinion, is sort of this workflow management piece, really sort of automating some work for people and helping them perform work in the lab. Oftentimes we think of LIMS or software in general in science as a hindrance to the work that we're doing on the bench. Good LIMS will actually help you work through those experiments, those processes, help enforce, as well as take some of those steps away that bench scientists have to do. There's typically a visualization and reporting component, so ensuring that the data that you are putting in, that you are centralizing, that you do have clean, you can now view it and understand what's going on and witness trends, or compile reports that you want to share at lab meeting or share with collaborators or put into a grant or share with regulatory bodies if that's kind of the area that you're in. And then there's kind of a typically sort of an equipment management component. So making sure that you have all of your equipment both categorized, but also understanding the maintenance schedules and how the equipment is being used, as well as some LIMS will have sort of this SOP, standard operating procedure management system, that really allows you to centralize that into a single place. And again, kind of view an SOP maybe while you're performing an experiment, and manage sort of the drafts and work around that. There are lots of other LIMS features here, and I've just tried to sort of generally categorize all of them, but if there's a feature that you're really thinking that I missed, please feel free to sort of add that into the chat, and we can make sure to speak to that one as well. And so again, if you're here, you probably knew sort of what those LIMS features you were interested in. You may also know why you need a LIMS, and if you're kind of on the fence about it, or just really exploring like, what is a LIMS? How is this going to help me? There are some typical signs that really can help you understand, is LIMS right for our lab? Is this going to really help us with our work, rather than add that extra barrier? And the thing that I like to think about is how much time your lab is spending. And usually it's across a lot of different things that the laboratory is doing, but thinking about how much time you're spending in understanding how an experiment was performed. So typically, if you're looking at sort of results data and you're going back between multiple Excel files to understand, how is this final analysis, the final analysis, I'm unclear on what the data is, making sure that you know how that's working. Oftentimes sort of a LIMS is going to help with that. If you're spending a lot of time emailing or sending spreadsheets back and forth of like, okay, here's my draft and now you send a draft, and back and forth like that, that also can be very prone to mistakes. Sometimes it can go against sort of regulatory or compliance regulations or guidelines. And so making sure that you're not kind of wasting a bunch of time on the back and forth of that. If you're transferring instrument files, so this is something that I am very familiar and we used to do, is moving instrument files with an external hard drive from machine to machine. So I moved it from the acquisition machine to the analysis machine to then my own machine, and then those results would end up, on my PI's desk. This is again very error prone. It's not it's not the most modern way to handle sort of file transfer, and there's lots of better ways that LIMS frankly can help do this as well. If you're spending a lot of time cleaning or trying to make sense of that data. So again, kind of back to that first point, is if you're unclear how a certain result got generated, or if you do have to clean the data because dates weren't entered properly, or there were pieces of metadata that you're now trying to compare capital M versus lowercase m, that type of stuff, oftentimes sort of a LIMS or a software solution in general can really help with. And then lastly, if you're trying to track down samples or data. So experiences that I've had in the lab are, here's the experiment we want to run. Here's the samples that we want to run them on. Oh, great. Like we're all ready to go. And then we spend for hours or sometimes days tracking down where those samples are in our freezers, which not only is a big waste of time, but it also can degrade the integrity of the samples that we are pulling out, sort of searching for in the freezer as well. So generally, you want that process to be quick and time efficient. Other signs that you may need a LIMS is if your lab is sort of like in an active growth phase, right? Like if you're hiring a lot, if you're going to get a bunch of new students in, usually more people means more data, more processes, more ways for things to go wrong. And so really trying to sort of rein that in during that growth phase is important. If your lab also has a high turnover rate, so if you're in academia or in other settings where you might have postdocs in for a handful of weeks and they leave and you're trying to utilize that data that they're generating, it's nice to have kind of a centralized place for everybody to put things in. Or if your lab has really standardized processes. So this is another lab that I was in, that we were in a translational group getting samples from clinical trials. We had a very set sort of protocol that we were doing on those samples. And it was very important for us to have a LIMS to help us sort of guide through those standardized processes to ensure that things were getting done as they should be getting done. And then lastly, if your lab is either in a regulated environment, so if you are working with sort of human-derived samples or potentially moving to a regulated environment, so maybe you're looking at CLIA certification or something else, you may really want a LIMS to help bolster your data integrity and ultimately, your resulting, your test results as well. And so we've touched on this a little bit, but LIMS can really help with a lot of those issues, and frankly, that's why we're here to talk about that. So, LIMS can really help with sort of simplifying that sample tracking piece, especially knowing where those samples are and what those samples are. So, no more. I have a bunch of tubes in a box that are labeled 1 through 100, and exactly what experiment did they come from? What media are they in? How long have they been frozen? That type of thing can help us with that sample tracking. Making sure that the data is correct going into the system, or flagging when data is incorrect or out of range of something. So enhancing that data integrity piece. So if I kind of mistype something as I'm entering, maybe I get a notification that is larger than what we anticipate, and I'm able to sort of do a second check on myself. Making sure that data is centralized, and this is a piece that I think in today's world gets a little underappreciated, but that centralization of data, even let's say it's not the most organized or it doesn't have the best data integrity, even not having to go through and search on like people's computers or in their folders or on their desk, or going from one drive to another to sort of pull data together, having that all centralized in one place is a huge time saver and makes the lab more efficient overall. And that leads into sort of providing those efficiency gains. So other ways that LIMS can help with efficiency is standardizing those workflows, making sure that they get automated, really efficiency in the back end as well during data analysis, because the data is clean, it's clear where it came from, you have sort of a record of how that was generated. And other efficiency gains in sort of reporting, you're not manually piecing together spreadsheets to create a report. It's sort of at your fingertips at that stage. And then also being able to improve that regulatory compliance. So, making sure that you have robust audit logs, you understand why data was changed and by whom and by when. You can have a QC component as well that helps with that overall compliance and reduce discrepancies and things like that. And then this is maybe a bit surprising in some cases, but there really is sort of an overall cost savings of LIMS, mostly because, lab folks now have more time in the lab to do the things that they're great at, and they can have a higher output of experiments. They can have a better quality of experimentation, so you're not rerunning experiments. You also may not be sort of rerunning experiments that happened a while ago because you can't find that data, or you're unsure of sort of those final results and how they were done. So ultimately, there really is sort of that cost savings here, and that's always a great benefit to share with your manager, because those are the types of things they're interested in. So speaking of that, there are two main buckets that I normally hear for folks when they're like, yeah, we really shouldn't get a LIMS, or we can't get a LIMS. And the first bucket is like, we don't have the resources, and whether or not that's sort of a budgetary resource or a time resource, like a human resource. I think those come up very frequently. The budget, to be frank, there's not too much we're going to be able to do about, budget constraints. However, what I will say is the modern LIMS that are out now definitely have a lower price point than the LIMS that some of us may be used to. And so looking into those modern LIMS, starting small, starting with a small user count or a small implementation, can really help kind of ease those budgetary constraints, and ultimately, when you're sharing this, talking about, well, what's the budget now for our staffing or for the experimentation, and do we think that we're going to recoup some of those costs with the gains that we will see with the LIMS system? The time component, both in sort of, there's an initial time component that I think is oftentimes the scariest for people, of how are we going to get started with a LIMS, and how are we going to migrate our data, and how are we going to implement the LIMS, and who's going to do this, because oftentimes we haven't hired someone specifically for this job, and oftentimes most people in the lab already have a lot to do. So how are we going to get this done, kind of from that first standpoint, and then also, how are we going to spend the time ongoing with making sure that it gets adopted, right? Change is hard. So how are we going to help our lab members adopt the software, use the software, also train them on the software, train somebody to administer the software? And those are the kind of the big scary things. But the reality is, again, especially with some of these modern LIMS, is that there are some companies that will offer to help you with migration, either as part of sort of an extra cost, which you'll need to evaluate if it's in that budget, or they'll help you do it as part of their normal fee. And so that's something really to consider, that you can do this, with limited resources as well. And that's really the same for implementation. Again, sort of the traditional LIMS that we're probably used to have very long implementation cycles. I think there's some organizations I remember, spending years on implementing a LIMS, and that's really certainly not the case for some of these more modern LIMS. And so the advice that you're getting from the vendor, and the support that you're getting from that vendor, really take them up on that, and utilize them, because they really are experts in that data piece, and you can be the expert in the science. And then kind of the same story with adoption and training. Many of these modern LIMS will have a focus on ease of use, and the ability for administrators to easily and quickly adjust the system for their growing needs. And so when you're doing kind of vendor evaluation, making sure that they're going to be supportive of that for you, in the way that you want, and of course in the budget that you want. But ultimately, I really don't think that time component is as big of a lift as it used to be, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And then the other piece that I've heard, and frankly, I will say that I've said in past labs, is we are not either big enough, we're not complex enough, we're not sophisticated enough to need a LIMS. And the reality here is that if you are experiencing any of those growing pains that we talked about, or are spending a lot of time, you probably are the right size. I'll say it that way, to need a LIMS. And if you want to get more efficient in the lab, this is one avenue to do that. The other thing to think about is that many new LIMS will also allow those groups to start small. So, as I mentioned, with a small user count, or you can start to consider sort of a pre-LIMS product, something like a sample or inventory management system that will help you with some of these pain points, but maybe not all of these pain points, and allow you to grow into a LIMS. And my advice here is find a company that allows you to grow, rather than, you pick one and now you have to go to another LIMS, and now you're in the state that you have multiple different sort of competing systems, and you're struggling with that. And then really the last piece that I'll end on here is how you can build a compelling case, right? The title of the webinar is How to Convince Your Boss, but really I think it's building a compelling case both for you, also the staff around you, and then of course the leadership and the folks that are making these budgetary decisions. And what you can do, and what I'd encourage you to do, is really consider what the lab goals are, or even the organizational goals. So have you been thinking about that CLIA certification, or have you moved into a new area where you want to start tracking human-derived samples, or are you in this big growth phase and you're wanting to be more efficient and to manage that well? Or potentially at the organizational level, is the organization sort of focusing on quality of data or fair data practices? And fair data practices, if you're not familiar, is sort of this concept that talks about the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reproducibility of data, which is very important, overall, right? Like, we want to be able to find data that's been generated. We want to make sure that it's also accessible, so the people that should have access to that data do have access, and potentially the other way, folks that shouldn't have access don't have access. But also that it's interoperable, so you're able to pull that data out of a system and utilize that system in other ways, or in other tools. And then obviously, the reproducibility of experimentation and of data is super important. I don't need to explain that any further. And then the other sort of advice that we have is really to engage the team. And there's a couple of different reasons why I suggest this. Making sure that you're capturing those specific pain points of what's happening in the lab currently, and making sure that when you're talking to LIMS vendors, that you really understand how their product can help with that. And that really allows you to kind of create a good case of, hey, Molly and the team is struggling with finding samples every week for her experiments. And so this LIMS system is going to help cut that time from 3 hours of looking for samples into 3 minutes. Those types of real life examples can really help people get excited about a LIMS. And then also working with a team to identify who might want to help evaluate a LIMS solution. So it's really important to get in there, get your hands dirty, make sure that a LIMS is going to do the things that you want it to do. And the best way to do that is to get the folks in the lab that are doing this work within the system, and really testing it out to make sure it's going to work for them. The other kind of bonus of engaging your team is you start to build momentum and excitement around a LIMS system. So it's not just you maybe making this compelling case. It's kind of multiple people in the lab that are interested. And then lastly, when you're talking about this at a bigger scale, making sure that you are being really specific in those problem statements. So, my fake example with Molly looking for samples, or other scenarios, making sure that you understand sort of that cost benefit. And so it's probably not going to be easy to say, oh, well, we would save $100 this week, or probably much more in a different time frame. But understanding, this is the hours cost that we're talking about. And when we're analyzing data, Steve is spending 5 hours cleaning the data before the analysis. And if we can trim that down to 30 minutes, that's a huge cost savings. And what does that look like, ultimately for the LIMS? And then lastly, making sure that you're keeping it relevant to your audience, right? So if you're talking to your PI that has expressed, a specific interest in starting a series of mouse vaccination studies, and you're talking about, the cell culture process, they may not be that interested. You may want to really focus on, okay, well, these are the lab initiatives that we talked about. These are the things that we're experiencing sort of pain points in, and making sure that it's relevant to the folks that you're talking to get them excited also about the benefits of a LIMS for your lab. So I'll end there, and happy to take questions. But the last thing that I'll sort of mention is, LabKey has been around for 20 years. I actually was a client of LabKey's prior to coming here, using their systems to build out a LIMS within our lab. And ultimately, the great thing I think about our company is that we really like to partner with people. We really are invested in your success and making sure that the solutions we're providing are helping you within the lab. And we pride ourselves on kind of that unique, very hands-on support that we provide. And if you have any questions about LIMS or other scientific data management systems, things like that, I'd be happy to schedule some time and chat with you about the needs of your lab. I think Tori's going to put a link to schedule that in the chat, so feel free to schedule that with me, and I'd be happy to talk with you. So with that, I think I'll kind of pause and see if there's any questions. And let you get on with your day. Okay, great. Yeah, I see a question here around how do you know when your lab needs kind of a pre-LIMS solution versus a LIMS solution. And really what it comes down to for me is sort of what are the budgetary constraints that your lab may have, and what pieces are you struggling with? What are those pain points? So if you are really struggling with kind of the basics of capturing the right metadata on samples, or finding samples within the system, you may be able to kind of start in those prelim solutions that really help you get started before you move into a LIMS. So again, kind of looking at those and thinking about what solutions right for you. And obviously, we're happy to have those discussions, and other vendors should be having those discussions with you as well, of really what's sort of needed at this time versus what might be needed in the future. Okay, great. And one more question here is, what are the traditional sort of implementation times for LIMS these days? I can only speak to what I know. So I'll talk about kind of the traditional LIMS I know are sort of months long. LabKey and some other modern LIMS that we've heard of is more on like I maybe say days to weeks basis, right? We're talking about 6 to 8 weeks. In a lot of cases, people can get up and running and starting to utilize and use their solutions within the lab. Okay, great. And last question here is sort of, How are limbs priced? And this can be varied a lot in the industry as well. Some of them can be sort of annual basis pricing. And so that's something you'll want to look at and see if that's something your lab can digest. Some of them are very modular, so you can pick and choose kind of what functionality you need. Sometimes that can get very expensive very quick because all of a sudden, you've added 5 different things and the price looks very different at the end. A lot of these sort of more modern LIM solutions are going to user-based pricing, again, to really keep that entry level cost as small as possible for labs, so you can try something out with a very low cost burden for your laboratory. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope you learned something today and learned something about LabKey and have a wonderful day.